Near the top of Arlington National Cemetery's original entranceway, the McClellan Gate, two lines of poetry were carved that seemed to perfectly encapsulate the solemn mission of the new resting place for more than 15,000 Union soldiers who died during the Civil War. It reads, "On fame's eternal camping ground, their silent tents are spread, and glory guards with solemn round the bivouac of the dead." It was, in hindsight, rather a strange choice to use in association with a Union War cemetery, considering the author of the poem, Theodore O'Hara, fought for the Confederacy. But this is just one of the many strange stories and contradictions that surround Arlington, a place that has been described as America's most hallowed ground, her most sacred shrine, or more simply, a beautiful garden of stone. It is the country's most famous burial ground, filled with row after row of identical white headstones, each of which lists the name and rank of someone who served their country with distinction, and in many cases, who died for it. What sets Arlington apart from the hundreds of other military cemeteries the US has created to bury those who fell in battle? It's probably a combination of a lot of things. Being one of the oldest established military cemeteries in the country, the traditions and customs established there have been copied all across the country. The fact that so many famous figures are buried there, generals, admirals, politicians, war heroes, even two presidents, its proximity to Washington, D.C. being literally just across the Potomac River from the Lincoln Memorial. But that level of prestige was built up over time. In the beginning, Arlington Cemetery was created out of a combination of necessity and one man's desire to get some small measure of revenge against someone he viewed as a traitor to his country. The traditions that make Arlington so famous were often created on the fly, responding to a need at that particular moment and later hardening into something glorious. The cemetery has been in a constant state of change since it was established, evolving along with the nation's views on death and the honors that should be accorded to fallen soldiers. And of course, it has grown larger, as the original dead from the Civil War have been joined by those who fought and died in every war the country has been involved in since. Welcome back to Geographics. I'm your host, Cosmic Horror Madman Eric Malachite, and today's script was provided by Ben Edelman. So be sure to show him some love in the comments as you deploy your like, subscribe, and ring that bell, and share this video with someone who loves learning about historical places. Let's get to it. The story of Arlington Cemetery begins, as many American stories do, with George Washington. Well, not him specifically, but rather his step-grandson, George Washington Parke Custis. After the death of his father when he was an infant, the Washingtons took in Custis, affectionately known as Washy, and the boy grew up at Mount Vernon, viewing the country's first president as a parental figure. Upon reaching his majority at the age of 21, Custis inherited a huge fortune in money, land, and slaves, courtesy of his late father, and had also inherited bequests from George and Martha Washington, all except for Mount Vernon, his childhood home. That had gone to his cousin, Bushrod Washington, who refused to sell it to him and, in fact, kicked him out. Custis moved to an 1,100-acre tract of property he'd inherited from his father outside of Arlington, Virginia, conveniently located just across the Potomac River from the new national capital, Washington, D.C. Custis decided to build his own palatial state there, the earliest example of Greek Revival architecture in the United States. Completed in 1818, Arlington House was located on a hilltop that could be seen for miles around, overlooking Washington City from its lofty perch across the river. The interior was a shrine to the capital's namesake, filled to bursting with Washington artifacts that Custis had inherited or collected, such as his campaign tent and china. Washy would live at Arlington House and the sprawling plantation that surrounded it until he died in 1857, upon which the estate was inherited by his daughter, Mary, and by extension her husband, Army Officer Robert E. Lee. Lee was considered one of the best officers in the U.S. Army, so when the secession crisis of 1861 turned into a full-scale civil war between North and South, he was the obvious choice to command the army of volunteers President Lincoln was raising to crush the rebellion. However, Lee turned down the command, instead resigning from the army, following along with his home state Virginia as it too seceded and joined the rebel Confederacy. When Lee left Arlington House for Richmond on April 22, 1861, he had no idea that he would never see it again. You know, a lot of people might say that, like the people in Arlington National Cemetery, privacy is dead, and it was certainly alarming discovering how much of my personal information was with data brokers. With today's sponsor, Delete Me, I found out that 18 of these companies had my personal information. Data brokers are companies that snatch up your personal info and sell or rent that information for a nominal price. And it's not just social media websites. They get this information from all over the internet, including government public records. Now, I'm pretty careful when it comes to what I do and don't do online, but you know something? You can never be too careful. This information included my name, age, past addresses, family members, marital status, and my wife's name as well. And with Delete Me, I was able to get it removed from these websites. Now, full disclosure, you can absolutely do this on your own. Every one of these data brokers has an opt-out process that you can follow. But if you're like me and you don't have the several hours it would likely take to follow that process for every website that has your information, Delete Me will help you keep your data more secure by doing all of that for you. All you have to do is sign up, follow the instructions in the welcome email, and tell them what information you'd like to be removed. So now is the time to safeguard your online privacy. Get 20% off Delete Me US consumer plans when you go to joindeleteme.com/geographics and use promo code Geographics at checkout. That's joindeleteme.com/geographics, code Geographics. A month after Lee's departure, Arlington was occupied by Union troops. It was a crucial strategic position. If the rebels had been able to place cannons on the hill overlooking the federal capital, they would have been able to bombard Washington with impunity. Initially, generals like Irvin McDowell and George McClellan, who had known Lee personally prior to the outbreak of the war, ordered that Lee's property be respected, refusing to stay inside the mansion but rather in a tent outside. It was a gentility that wasn't to last very long. The Civil War very quickly descended into wholesale slaughter, the likes of which America had never seen before. A combination of modern weapons and outdated tactics meant that thousands, even tens of thousands of men were killed in every major battle, with many more suffering terrible injuries that the antiquated medical knowledge of the period was still ill-equipped to treat. Disease was the biggest threat, responsible for 2/3 of the deaths suffered by the warring armies. As the nearest major northern city to the eastern theater of the war, Washington was transformed into one of the world's largest hospitals, as wounded or sick soldiers were shipped back to the capital by train or wagon by the thousands. Many of these men would die of their injuries or of infection, and the city's cemeteries very quickly ran out of room for new burials. For thousands of years, those who fell in battle were handled in similar ways, often buried in shallow mass graves, all jumbled together with no thought given to identifying who had been buried where. But feelings on death had changed by the time of the Civil War, and it was felt that those brave men who died in the service of their country deserved a proper burial wherever it was possible. Meaning an individual properly dug grave, even if it was impossible to identify who had been buried. 42% of those who died in the Civil War were unidentified. But this required space, lots of space, and around Washington it was running out fast. The Union Army's Quartermaster General Montgomery Meigs looked across the river at Arlington, still occupied by federal troops, and hit upon an idea. Meigs hated Robert E. Lee, viewing him as a traitor to his country and to the blue uniform he once wore, and that hatred only grew in magnitude as Lee emerged as the conflict's most brilliant tactician, routinely mauling Union armies sent against him in battles like Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville. Meigs realized that if he turned Arlington into a cemetery, not only would it solve the problem of space to bury the fallen soldiers, it would also make the place uninhabitable for the Lees or anyone else after the war ended. And so it was that, beginning in May 1864, Union soldiers who died in and around Arlington were delivered to Arlington for burial. While the enlisted men were buried in neat rows out on the grounds, Meigs made sure to get his point across, instructing that the bodies of officers were to be buried in Mrs. Lee's prized garden, within steps of the front door of Arlington House. Many of the property's 63 slaves, who had been formerly freed by the Emancipation Proclamation, were now hired as some of Arlington's earliest gravediggers. Eventually, some 16,000 Union casualties were buried at Arlington, which was one of a network of over 100 national cemeteries established all across the country to hold the nearly 350,000 men who had died on the Union side during the war. Initially, these graves were marked with simple wooden head markers, but eventually Congress set aside money to replace these with more permanent rectangle marble headstones, the basic design of which, with some modifications, is still used in military cemeteries today. Robert E. Lee never saw Arlington again. After the war ended with a Confederate defeat, the Lees moved to Lexington, Virginia, where Lee accepted the job of president of Washington College, today Washington and Lee University, where he died in 1870. Mrs. Lee, who had grown up in Arlington House, never really got over the loss of the property, while Lee himself was much more stoic about it. Perhaps he realized, all things considered, he'd gotten off lightly considering there were many in the North that wanted to see him hanged as a traitor. Eventually, in 1882, the Supreme Court ruled that the federal government had illegally seized Arlington from the Lees and ordered it returned to them. Their son, George Washington Custis Lee, then made the pragmatic decision to sell the property back to the government for the sum of $150,000, worth $4.1 million in today's money. Today, Arlington House is a museum administered by the National Park Service, separate from the rest of the cemetery, which is still controlled by the Army. Arlington began to transform from a simple Civil War cemetery to America's most hallowed ground in 1898, when the USS Maine exploded in the harbor of Havana, Cuba. Though later investigations would conclude that the explosion, which sunk the battleship and resulted in the deaths of 260 sailors and Marines, was an accident, public opinion caused the incident to become a rallying cry for war with Spain, Cuba's rulers. The conflict, known as the Spanish-American War, was a splendid little war, in the words of the Secretary of State, a short conflict resulting in a glorious victory. The federal government made a fateful decision in the aftermath of this conflict, which claimed an estimated 5,500 American lives. Instead of leaving the fallen soldiers buried where they fell in and around battlefields in Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines, that they should be disinterred and transported home. This established a pattern that has continued into every war the country has been involved with since. Several hundred Spanish-American War dead were buried at Arlington, and they would be joined by more than 150 of those who perished on board the Maine, a memorial to which is located today in Section 24 of the cemetery. There were now more than 20,000 burial plots at Arlington, and the size of the cemetery had grown from 200 acres to 450 acres by the end of the 19th century. The 20th century, however, would see Arlington fully transformed from a military cemetery into a national shrine. More than 116,000 Americans died in uniform during World War I, a heavy burden that was not lessened by the fact that the country had gotten off relatively lightly, casualty-wise, compared to the millions of dead suffered by countries like Great Britain, France, and Germany. Following what by now had become an established routine, members of the Army's Graves Registration Service fanned out across the Western Front after the war ended, collecting fallen U.S. soldiers and reinterring them in one of 8 military cemeteries in France and Belgium. Families had the option to request that the government repatriate their loved ones' remains back to the United States, and more than 5,000 of them were eventually buried at Arlington. The most famous of the fallen doughboys is a man that, in truth, we don't know anything about. He is one of more than 2,000 American soldiers that fell in battle and were unable to be identified. He was selected at random to be taken home from France in a most solemn ceremony and laid to rest in the newly constructed Tomb of the Unknown Soldier in Arlington. The idea was copied from the British and French, who interred their own unknown soldiers in Westminster Abbey and under the Arc de Triomphe, respectively. The anonymity of the soldier means that for thousands of grieving families, the body in the tomb could be their missing loved one, who marched off to war and never came home. The tomb of the unknown soldier is ceremonially guarded 24 hours a day, 365 days a year by the Tomb Guards, an elite section of the Army's 3rd Infantry Regiment, the Old Guard, who oversee the funeral customs and traditions at Arlington. Initially, as with many Arlington traditions, the Tomb Guards were a matter of necessity. Visitors to the site were caught climbing on the tomb or having their picture taken in front of it by professional photographers who set up shop around it, and other actions that were inappropriate considering the site is a war grave. Now the tourists are kept behind a velvet rope, but many of them aren't there to see the tomb these days. But the Tomb Guards, particularly the highly elaborate changing of the guard ritual that takes place every half hour when the cemetery is open to the public. The World War I unknown soldier was joined in 1958 by unknown soldiers from World War II and the Korean War, who are entombed underneath the World War I soldier sarcophagus and marked with stone slabs. President Ronald Reagan oversaw another ceremony to bury an unknown soldier from the Vietnam War in 1984. But this turned out to be a touch premature. More than a decade later, the remains were positively identified through DNA testing as belonging to Air Force Lieutenant Michael Blassie. The tomb has been empty ever since. It is highly unlikely that there will ever be any more unknown soldier internments at Arlington or anywhere else. That is because the US military has been using increasingly advanced forensic techniques to not only positively identify service members killed in current conflicts, but also to attempt to identify fallen soldiers from as far back as World War I. The most modern innovation is the Armed Forces Repository of Specimen Samples for the Identification of Remains, located at Dover Air Force Base in Delaware. The repository keeps blood samples on file of every single active duty service member in the US military, which can be used in DNA comparison testing to identify unknown remains. It is the least the country can do to honor those who have made the ultimate sacrifice for it, the dignity of being buried under one's own name. Arlington's most famous funeral took place on November 25, 1963. The entire country was in mourning. 3 days earlier, President John F. Kennedy had been assassinated in Dallas, and now an audience of millions was preparing to watch his state funeral on their television screens. The first ever live broadcast of a presidential funeral. Arlington Cemetery was a bit of a surprise choice as Kennedy's final resting place. Only one former president, William Toward Taft, had been buried there previously, and most presidents went home to be buried in their home states, like Abraham Lincoln's elaborate tomb in Springfield, Illinois. Indeed, many members of the slain president's inner circle favored returning Kennedy's remains to Boston, his hometown. But in the end, it was Jackie Kennedy who made the final decision that her husband should be buried at Arlington, so that, in her words, he would belong to the nation. A site had been picked out by the Kennedy family on the 23rd, and Arlington staff worked feverishly throughout the 24th to get the burial plot ready for the funeral the next day. At around 10:45 a.m., a Joint Service Honor Guard carried President Kennedy's casket out of the rotunda of the Capitol building, where he had been lying in state, and placed it on a ceremonial artillery caisson pulled by 6 white horses, a traditional funeral cortege that echoed back to the days of the Civil War. It was a huge funeral procession that included a small army of honor guardsmen representing every branch of the military. Flags snapped in the wind, drums, horns, and bagpipes played, all was regimented and orderly, with the notable exception of the riderless horse, Blackjack, who was visibly skittish and restless throughout the long funeral march. His handlers worried about the potential embarrassment of Blackjack getting loose and running wild on national TV. Fortunately, this didn't happen, though the tall black horse surely didn't win any friends among his handlers that day, particularly when he stepped on one of their feet. After a funeral mass at St. Matthew's Cathedral, the procession then headed for Arlington, where Kennedy was laid to rest in front of a crowd of dignitaries that included presidents, prime ministers, and royalty. Over 200 foreign officials from 92 countries were in attendance, the largest gathering of brass in one place in decades. The grave was topped off by an eternal flame, initially a jury-rigged device because of the speed of that weekend's preparations, later replaced with a permanent structure that still burns to this day. In addition to Mrs. Kennedy, the late president's brothers, Robert and Ted, acted as the mourners-in-chief of the day, Eventually, all three of them would return to be buried in Arlington beside JFK, Robert in 1968, Jackie in 1994, and Ted in 2009. The funeral of John F. Kennedy completed the century of transformation at Arlington from military cemetery to national shrine. In the year after JFK's burial there, the number of visitors to Arlington jumped from 4 million a year to 7 million. And to this day, millions upon millions descend upon the cemetery to see the solemn sights, which includes not only Kennedy's eternal flame, but the tomb of the unknown soldier, the monuments to national tragedies such as the Space Shuttle Challenger disaster, or the 9/11 attack on the Pentagon, located just outside Arlington's gates. Arlington's place as more than a simple cemetery is solidified by the fact that you have to be screened by metal detectors in order to visit the place today. It is sometimes easy to forget, considering all the historic burials and monuments at Arlington, that it is still an active cemetery. Between 25 and 30 burials a day are conducted during weekdays. Annually, around 6,900 internments take place there. Most of the burials are the last survivors of the Greatest Generation, veterans of World War II and the Korean War, along with an increasing number of Vietnam veterans. Arlington's popularity as a resting place has led to concerns that the cemetery may actually run out of room for new burials. To combat this, the Army has introduced stricter burial requirements, restricting in-ground burials to those who are killed on active duty, those who retired from the armed forces after serving at least 20 years, and those who earned a high decoration for valor in combat, such as the Medal of Honor. The cemetery has also expanded to its current size of 650 acres, and constructed a large columbarium to hold cremated remains. The restrictions there are much looser, allowing anyone who served in the military to be interred there. There are all sorts of notable people buried at Arlington. Famous generals, astronauts, war heroes, government officials, judges, everyone from Pierre Charles L'Enfant, the architect who designed the street plan for Washington, D.C., to trailblazing boxer Joe Louis, are buried there. But the vast majority of the more than 400,000 people buried at Arlington are unknown to anyone but their families. Some of them are unknown to everyone. But they all have one thing in common: they served their country with all the hardships and sacrifices that came with it. And now all of them rest here equally, regardless of rank or race or religion. Those who are buried in America's hallowed ground are all members of the same silent army, the Bivouac of the Dead. I hope you learned something today, and if you enjoyed this video, be sure to deploy your likes, comment a famous place we haven't covered, subscribe, and ring that bell, and share this video with someone who loves learning about the world's wildest places. And thanks again to Delete Me for sponsoring this video. Remember to follow the link in the description and pin comment to get 20% off your subscription. It's a small price to pay to help keep your private data safe from bad actors. I'm Eric Malachite, and we'll see you next time.